So to me, hiring excellence is a connected story that starts at the end with outcome, successful outcome, and works its way all the way back through to what was the business case put forward for why the role should be open in the first place.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm Shannon Ogborn, your host, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO and beyond. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Jim Miller, our very own VP of People and Talent here at Ashby. Throughout his career, Jim has tackled many different roles, including operating in the recruiting space for 15 years at Google, from overseeing recruiting teams in APAC and EMEA to online channels and beyond. After Google, Jim joined Fullstory as their VP of Recruitment, where he took full ownership of the global recruiting function, systems, and processes. We are super excited to now have Jim on the Ashby team and, of course, on the podcast with us. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Well, let's give the audience a little bit of background on yourself and what you're currently up to. Can you tell us what your role is at Ashby?
My title is VP of People and Talent, but I seem to be wearing many hats. So doing the people part, and I'm definitely doing the talent part. I'm a recruiter, have been for 22 years, and I still love it. But I'm also involved in other things, from some of the community work that you're involved in, Shannon, to customer advisory. I'm getting on calls with folks who are trying to solve problems, to even some of our sales calls. It's been a lot of variety since I joined in the last 10 weeks.
Yeah. How has that been different from some of the larger companies you worked at, just out of curiosity?
It's kind of typical in a bigger company that you become more and more specialized in your role. So, the Fullstory, my focus was very much on the talent space, although I was part of the people operations leadership team. So here it's very different because there's a lot more business opportunity, things for me to get involved in. At Google, I tended to have quite a wide range of different responsibilities simply because the business area I looked after touched so many different elements of talent, but it was still very focused on the talent space.
Yeah, it's a really interesting experience. We crossed over at Google at a point, but it's an interesting experience going from such a large organization where you're scoped down a bit to a smaller organization where you're scoped up a ton. I think it's just a really neat experience to be able to touch all these areas of the business.
Absolutely. Scope's an interesting thing, though. Dealing with millions of candidates with a small scope.
Yeah.
It's just the variety of the work and the problems that you solve. That's the thing that I find fascinating all the time.
Agreed. So, as you mentioned, you have been in the recruiting space for 22 years. Can you tell me about one of the biggest challenges you've seen really permeate the talent space throughout your career in recruiting?
Challenge, opportunity, it's similar to me. I think the big thing that I've seen, the change and the challenge that folks are still trying to get their heads around, it is the use of search. So I started off in recruiting in 2001. Google was 3 years old. And people had really just started to search for everything in their lives on the internet with some level of accuracy, thanks to Google. And when I started in recruiting, one of the very first lessons, possibly on my first day, great candidates don't apply for jobs. That's what I was told. And I've heard that continuously through my career. I went through a journey of being the sourcing expert in my agency days, and then the sourcing expert in my early days at Google, to the point where they gave me some budget and told me to start a sourcing team for Europe, and then did the same thing for Asia eventually. So I was the sourcing guy, going out and finding great passive talent. And then I got the opportunity to take over the online channel, which is basically all of the inbound stuff at Google, all the inbound applications, but everything from job description creation to relationships with third parties where we advertise, down to the resume screening, and then the distribution of talent. And you're talking about millions of applications per year going through that particular team. And I think one of the reasons why I ended up in that role was to try and bring all of the learnings from sourcing and turn them around into candidate attraction and see what would work. And I ended up in that role for best part of 7 years, I think, 6, 7 years. And I've come out of it the other side truly believing that a key element of any strategy is inbound, online applications, job advertising, and what that can bring. But the challenge there are multiple elements to it. One is volume. And we can see that from the reports that Ashby are putting out, the trend reports and so on, especially at the moment, how the increased volumes of applications exist, especially in the early stages of a job being advertised. And volume can create problems all of its own kind, but it can also be a great thing. The other piece is elements of bias. That's still that bias built into not just recruiting organizations and recruiters, but also hiring managers of the quality of an online applicant versus the inbound sourced person, because it seems that everyone had this pervasive thought of great candidates not applying for jobs. And it's just not true. It's also seen as a tool for more junior hiring. And it's difficult to show the value for a more senior, more complex hire. I've tackled that problem a few times over the years. But when you boil it down, the key thing, I think, is you've got to become very, very good at continuous measurement and continuous improvement of that particular channel to get it work for you, to get it to work for you, for your environment, for the way that your company likes to work. And then building out a model that's very connected, very aligned, to use that as the kind of primary channel. And I think if you get that right, and you get that measurement and that continuous improvement right, then you can have an enormous amount of success with that channel and be much more effective, efficient, cost effective as well.
For sure. I'm curious if you ever bought into this premise of online applicants aren't quality. Like, did you come to this conclusion at some point, or did you start with a mindset of, oh, this isn't right?
I was told it and believed it for a short period of time at the beginning of my career, and I didn't know any better. And I'm a tinkerer. I'm an experimenter. I love an A/B test. And I started to optimize my job ads that I was writing as a recruitment agent to attract talent for the roles that I was placing. They were mostly contract roles. This was software engineers in London in the early 2000s. And I started to get really good results because I was optimizing the job ads that I was putting out with. I did research into the mechanisms that enable a job to come out top of a list. And really what I was trying to drive was volume and accuracy. And that hasn't changed a great deal over time. I believe that pipeline solves all ills in recruiting, and quality pipeline is the best you could possibly have. Quality is alignment and less kind of waste because of the wrong candidate applying. Doesn't necessarily mean they are low quality. They're just the wrong candidate for the right role at the right time. You got to get the right candidate in. So I started that journey and I started to get really good results. And if you get really good results from online on some of your roles and a growing proportion of your roles over time, then you have to spend less time sourcing on specific positions, on those positions, but you gain more time to source on the roles that you can't fill through the online channel. And you get to create a balance, a true mix from the different channels, and you become a more effective producer, whether you're an individual contributor, recruiter in an agency, a recruiter in a company, or even the leader who's putting together this kind of channel mix strategy.
Definitely. I know you have, as you said, a lot of recruiters just get handed this premise, right, of online applicants are bad, candidates from XYZ source are always bad. There's job pages where I've been told this is true. I actually believed it for a long time, and I actually said it for a long time. So it's interesting to kind of come around to a different talk track there. But I know you have a little bit of a unique perspective on the order of operations of reviewing candidates. I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I try and break down I try and break down everything into the constituent parts. I'm a great believer of the science of incremental gains. If you improve every little element of a process, you get a big overall incremental gain. So to me, you've got to look at the right pathway to hire to get to the end results of what your company's looking for. I'm very outcome based. So the way I look at it in general terms is internal mobility is your best, most effective channel to fill a role. We've got some blog posts and so on about internal mobility that you can go and read about. But to me, if you can fill a position with somebody who already knows the company, the culture, has a bunch of the skills for the role, and that leaves a seat that's more junior open, that's an easier hire to make if you have to go external. So if you can do that continuously through the company, moving people through the chairs to only leave the more junior positions open to the external hiring, you're going to hire that much more effectively as a company. You also build a whole bunch of cultural capital with that. You build trust. Your workforce start to really trust that you have their best interests at heart and they can have a long and fulfilling career in your company. That's huge. Retention, company, employer experience, and so on and so forth. So that's always my starting point, a fair and equitable internal mobility program where every single job is posted for at least a week internally before you go external. And it's your recruiters who are owning that process. So they're not in competition with somebody on an internal mobility team, because competition in that sense for recruiting, that just breaks all your efficiencies and effectiveness. So internal mobility first. Then get the job description right. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at online as your channel, employer referrals as your channel, sourcing as your channel, even the internal mobility piece. You've got to get the job description right. And that means understanding what the outcome is of that hire. What's the return on your investment? What does success look like for a candidate 6 months into the role, someone who's effective early and very successful? What attributes do they need? What skills, qualifications, experiences does that person need in order to be successful in that role? That gives you the minimum requirements. The minimum requirements of a job, that's the key element. That's the structure, the skeleton of the story you will tell with that job description. And then you tell the story of the job, why it exists, what the requirements are, what does success look like, a bit about the company culture, potentially some examples of people who've been in the role or similar roles and so on. And people can then see themselves in the job. And those minimum requirements should be written in a way that folks can put the evidence of their experience of meeting those minimum requirements on their resume in a simple form. It makes it easy for them to write their resume to match the role. If you get all of that right, it doesn't matter whether you're sending it to someone you're sourcing, or whether one of your employees is recommending the job to somebody else with an employer referral, or it's an online job ad, you're going to get the right kind of response. It comes back to that accuracy. The right candidate applying for the right role right now saves you a huge amount of time. Time is the one finite resource that recruiters have. So if you optimize all of this stuff correctly, brilliant. And then the next level of that optimization is the sourcing bit. You're like, hang on a second, this guy's talking about online and job ads, and now he's talking about sourcing. But it's the reverse. Who does the search when it's an online application? It's the candidate. And in effect, the candidate is writing a search to find the job instead of you writing the search to find the candidate. So your job ad is one to many instead of your sourcer being one to many. And that has a gearing effect that you can get to far, far more candidates. So if you get the keywords right in your job description, natural language, industry standard language for job titles, if you get the keywords in there, if you describe your entire tech stack so that the discoverability engines in these third-party jobs start to push it to the right talent, you then get the online applications who've been driven by technology to the job because it's such a close alignment to their skills. And those folks are receiving those job adverts in their inboxes, not in their in-mail. And those jobs coming into their inboxes are hitting folks who are passive talent. So in effect, you are sourcing, but by a different name, talent who is passive, and you're turning them into active talent. And that's the way you can then break the bias. And if you get that right and you measure that quality coming in, you can then make the decision about whether you need to push employee referrals or if you need to go spend the time sourcing. And that's how I then create this hierarchy all the way through. And of course, with online applications, you're basically enabling anyone with the aspirational goal of working for your company to apply. They don't have to know somebody who works there already in order to get reviewed and get considered for the job. And they don't have to be found by someone. So they don't have to have, filled out their LinkedIn profile with all the bells and whistles and everything else. But instead, they can make their own conscious decision once they've done their research into your company as to whether or not they want to apply. And that goes a long way to helping you have a fully representative workforce as well. So it's very powerful. So that's how I think about it.
In your time, and yes, like you said, it's a little bit backwards to what people are used to, but in your time presenting this concept or idea of this order of operations, who do you feel like you've gotten the most pushback from? Has it been recruiters and sourcers, or has it been more IC levels who are like, that's not what I know, that's not what I've heard, I know a completely different order of operations that I operated on in the past? Or has it been more recruiting people in executive leadership who have brought those concerns to the table?
It's very much the latter. Hiring managers really don't mind where the candidate comes from. Once they see the resume and they're like, wow, this person's great, they fit my role perfectly. Recruiting, good job. They don't mind whether that's a source candidate or a referred candidate or online. In the back of their minds, they should prefer that the candidate is active and looking rather than someone that's had to be sold to by a sourcer. That's my take on it. The recruiters, honestly, once it's up and running and it's working, especially if you've taught them how to optimize the job properly, so less of their time is wasted reviewing candidates who aren't a fit, suddenly realize, hang on a second, for the time I spend, remember that finite resource is time for any recruiter, for the time I spend screening compared to the time I would spend sourcing, I get a much greater return on that time if I've got the right pipeline coming in. And of course, you can close it at any time to stop the volume once you've got enough data and analytics. So the group that I've had the most resistance from has absolutely been the senior leadership within recruiting who brought up with the same kind of generation, probably the wrong word, but that kind of group who have the same perspective and said it for a long time and never thought back to whether it was true or not. They just believed it. And a great example is executive hiring. I mean, what do you do when you want an executive when you're in a company? You go out to a third-party executive search company because they're the people with the network, right? Rolodexes and then all of this kind of good stuff. And it's the same in previous companies. I'm like, well, let me test this because, everyone's been Googling for 25 years. Come October, I think that's right. Maybe it's 26 years in October. And folks know that they can go and look for a job. And these job matching engines on LinkedIn and other products send really good fit roles to people, even if they're not looking, including executives. So you try putting your next CTO role out there as a job ad just to test before you go to the executive search company that you want to spend six figures with, or the next CMO search or your next head of revenue, whatever the executive role is, just test it. Just see what you get coming back. And I've done that a couple of times, and the end results have made people go, you're kidding me. We did not expect director and VP and SVP level roles to be filled by an online ad. Indeed, there's been competition with almost boutique exec search firms internally sometimes when I've put these methods into practice. And of course, they're like, hang on, that's my livelihood. You can't go and do things like that. So it's really powerful, but you've got to be able to get to the point of experimentation. And it's relatively cheap to just do the experiment for a week or two, when normally you'd be going and having these third-party conversations. Just hold off on that for a second, just to see what you get. And you might be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, especially now, like you were alluding to, our trend reports on applications. more and more people are applying to jobs, and it certainly, yes, is the job market, but I think that people are, even at a high level of leadership, are getting used to being able to search and find roles themselves, because yes, they could be working with an executive firm that is presenting them opportunities, but they don't have all the opportunities that are searchable. And so as a candidate, you want to have like an eyes wide open situation where you're able to find all of the roles, and having the role open for on the company side really allows you to have a more diverse, wider range of applicants in your pipeline as well. So I think it's
Exactly.
a great thought there. So how does this fit into the concept of continuous improvement?
Well, there's two things. One, volume is obviously an issue, right? If you have too much volume coming in, then it can take up too much time. So you have to be very good at measuring, and time is actually your friend. So if you go and do your analytics on how many candidates do we actually need to fill a role, and the recruiting joke there, by the way, is one. You only need one, the successful candidate. But for this case,
Right.
how many applicants do we traditionally need to see in order for the waterfall to come all the way down to making an offer, with all the pass-through rate calculations and everything else? So you run that first of all. Then you look at, well, how many of those do I need if I took out all of the employer referrals and all of the sourced hires that we'd made previously? And again, I'm only looking at externally filled roles. The internal mobility stuff is separate to this. So how many external applicants through a job ad will I need in order to fill this role based on past data? So you get to a number. And then you can calculate, well, how long do I need to post a job in order to get that number of applicants? And that should give you a fair idea of when to stop the pipeline generation. And knowing when to stop is one of the key desires of a recruiting leader for their team. And for years and years and years, that really hasn't existed because people feel very uncomfortable taking down a role. Hiring managers look at their job being posted as evidence that recruiting are doing their work and so on. But nowadays, with the power of the analytics, Ashby's analytics and so on, and other tools, you can actually measure this stuff very, very well. And then you test against it. Did we open the role, get the number of applications within the time frame, or did we get more? Did I have to close it earlier? So you're constantly reinforcing that entry volume and what the accurate number is for a position. Then you're looking at the pass-through rates, and did they align to the historical data that I was expecting? And did we make a hire? What was the outcome of the work that we did? Did we need to reopen the role in order to push more pipeline in a greater amount? So you constantly refine this. You're continuously improving your model until you get it down to a level of accuracy where any particular role you can go, yeah, that position, we're probably going to need to open that for 6 days, and we think we will definitely fill that from online. Let's go. You'll always get a few referrals, and maybe a recruiter will do a little bit of sourcing, and there's a distinct chance you'll fill it through internal mobility before the role even goes live. But if you run the data and you do this every single time, you can look at the volumes coming in and you know when to stop. Eventually, you get to an utopia moment of this role will be open for 3 days. That's our expectation. And then you can give complete transparency to the candidate pool, the applicant pool, to know what's going to happen with that job and when to apply and so on. And eventually that date will start to shrink because you're pushing more people to apply faster. So putting all of those pieces into place is key. There's another side to it as well. You've got to be able to limit applications. So limiting through time that the job is posted is one thing, but application rules, blocking rules, you don't want duplicate applications for the same role and so on. One of the key things I learned was by reducing the number of applications a human can make during a time period, forces the person to look more at the suitability and accuracy of the job to their skills. So I'll go into a little story, if I may. When I worked at Fullstory and you had the ability to watch the journeys of people with heat maps and so on through their application journey, we found that 2/3 plus of applicants really only looked at the job title. Okay? They didn't get down into the rest of the job description. Now, the 30-odd% that did get into the job description, they turned out to be the stronger candidates. So that's pretty powerful in its own right. But if you can force people to go past the job title through some kind of mechanism, like a restriction on the number of roles someone can apply to, forcing them to do their diligence on the suitability of that position for them and their skills, all of a sudden you start to push out the candidates who aren't qualified for the role. And you start to have a consistent pool of talent who are qualified against the minimum requirements that you've got, which means you can then be super objective with your screening and go through and push the highest quality, most representative group of talent through the process for that particular job, saving you an enormous amount of time. So you have lots of different angles to do with the analytics to then do this continuous improvement. And all of it really hinges on time being a critical metric in lots of different ways. And when you get it right, you optimize the channel, you get pipeline in faster, so you have a faster time to fill. They're active candidates, so you get better closing rates, and everyone's happier in general. And if you have happy hiring managers, you have happy recruiters.
100%. When everything is working full steam ahead properly, the relationships are good, the candidates are flowing the right way, everyone is better off for sure. I have to ask because I do think, and this is also my experience, working at Google and talking to friends and recruiting outside of Google, they're like, okay, great, this type of situation where you're getting online applicants, right, of course that works for a company like Google because it's Google. Who's not trying to apply? What is your take, or how would you pose this to companies to set them up for success when maybe they're a smaller company, they don't have as strong of employer brand? Like, what is the critical piece here to seeing success with this, using this order of operation with like intermobility and then online channels first?
Well, the internal mobility is key, first of all, because it then gives you the less complex, more junior positions to hire externally, which always helps. The other piece is that discoverability and optimization part. So when I joined Fullstory, I went and put this methodology into place, and in the long term, it was successful. But I remember having a call with a company that was selling a SaaS product around customer experience, and they based their pricing on application volumes. Reasonable way of modeling the pricing for a company doing that. And they knew how big we were as a company. And I got a second take when I told them how many applications we were getting. They were like, how many? And I was like, this many. And they were like, but that's off the charts for a company of your size. How you do what? And of course, it would have meant that their product was super expensive for us as a company. We didn't end up going
right.
there. So they have to go back and rethink their pricing model. But it comes down to some relatively simple steps. First of all, the job title. Make it industry standard. Because the same lesson I learned all the way back in 2001 when I'm trying to optimize these job descriptions to hire contract software engineers in London, the same algorithms are still in use. The job title alignment to either a search or a matching on a profile carries the most weight. So if someone has done the job and calls themselves whatever they call themselves, and that matches the job title, that job will get pushed to them more often and be more accurate.
And let's be honest, people are taking real creative liberties as of late with job titles. It's like, I couldn't even tell you based on this job title what the job does, and you then look at the job and you're like, that is not even close to what I thought that the job would be.
I had a resume screener once. I'm in the Dublin office of Google, and tapped me on the shoulder. She said, Jim, can you look at this? I don't understand it. I've got these amazing software engineers applying for this job. It's like, what's the problem with that? We need amazing software engineers. They're like, well, but this job is this. I was like, GPS learning navigation specialist. And of course, software engineers were looking at this going, GPS, global positioning satellite, learning navigation. This is machine learning within geo mapping thing. This must be Google Maps. This is a machine learning job in Google Maps. I'm going to apply for it. I'll be brilliant for this job. This is my background and experience. And that's who all the applicants were. What did GPS mean at Google, Shannon?
The acronyms have left me, which may be a good thing.
Google People Services.
Oh, Google People Services.
Learning Navigation Specialist. Learning Navigation was training. This was a training program manager.
Oh boy.
Coordinated training courses within the People Operations Department.
Oh boy.
They
That's a real facepalm.
They used the internal language and made it an external job title. Don't do that. You will get less applications, and the applications you do get are not going to be accurate to the job you're looking to fill, right? It's one of my favorite examples. I will not talk about a German vacuum cleaner company who everyone who ever applied to a certain department ended up with their display ads coming up on every single property they ever did on the web. Anyway, so job titles hugely important, but then so keywords. I mentioned tech stack earlier. I'll give you another example. 2 departments had exactly the same job globally, right? 2 different parts of an organization. One group took the recruiting strategic decision to write at the bottom, you must have experience coding in any 4th generation coding language. Right? They were like, we're very open. We don't mind what you code in. We just want great coders. You'll come, you'll be able to do anything you want. The other business group took the recruiting decision to write a list of the 4th generation coding languages that they might be interested in. The group that chose the list hired the same profile 10 times faster than the other group, including getting referrals from people who did the job in the first group and knew they were hiring, but couldn't find the job themselves when they were searching for the one to refer their friends to. So their friends were getting jobs in the other department. And this person came to me, this head of recruiting for this department, said, I need your help. I need sourcing support on this job. And I'm like, well, we don't seem to have any problem hiring that role elsewhere. What's the issue? And I went down, I just went line by line. Oh, look, here's your problem. When people search for Java or C++ and the other skills or job title or whatever, they're finding this job, but your job does not appear. Because the search engines still work in the same way. It's the same thing with Boolean logic. If you search for a keyword, you don't get profiles. You don't get profiles who don't mention it. I think double negative, but I think I got it the right way around. If that keyword is not on the profile, that profile will not be returned in your search, right? And recruiters forget that. So you've got to make your role discoverable. So one of the things I put in place at Fullstory was every single job had the whole tech stack as part of the boilerplate. And that helped with discoverability, because if someone put Kubernetes in their search, it would come up. Even if that wasn't a core requirement for the job, it just helped with the discoverability.
Isn't it amazing, though, that in the example that you gave, the other team was making an effort to be like, we're open to all languages, and it actually ended up hurting their pipeline because it wasn't discoverable, like you're saying.
You've got to understand the mechanics behind these things and how they work in order to put a strategy together that's effective. You're better off writing relatively long lists of different synonyms, in effect, or variations of a particular name or type of technology than you are just giving very open language because of discoverability and accuracy of application. So discoverability, job titles, keywords, they're critically important in driving pipeline. So then if you get all of that right, if you've written the story right with the right structure, the right ingredients, all of a sudden the matching engines start to push your job out to more people. And all of your application volumes start to increase because your job looks attractive. You've told the story, you've explained what success looks like, you've got great transparency about the kinds of work done, you've got examples. I mean, go and look at one of the job ads that Abika, the VP and co-founder, VP of engineering co-founder writes. You know, fantastic example of storytelling through a job description. Start to drive your applications. It doesn't matter about your brand. The job description will hook people in, and then they'll go and research your brand, and then they'll apply. But you can go even further. You can do AdWords sponsorship on Google to find people who are searching for a particular job. And in effect, what they're going to get served generally is a job board that has a list of those roles. You can get in ahead of them for not too much money, and all of a sudden divert potential applicants who would apply to a range of roles just to apply to your position. There's a whole range of different techniques and tactics that you can go to if you want to take this further and really drive a disproportionate volume of applications to your company. And those extra applications, although they might not get hired for the role, you can only hire one person per open headcount, right? Are going to build your database for the future. And they're going to be the folks that you can shortlist and build relationships with and do the real kind of strategic sourcing, the stuff that people dream of. I listened to Benji's podcast and he's like, people need to be strategic and think about the long term of that and build the pipeline across roles and have company mapping and all of that good stuff. You can do all of that if you build the pipelines right the first time you go to market rather than redoing everything every single time. Again, it's all elements of continuous improvement and measurement and redefining your strategy and getting the incremental gains all the way.
Absolutely. I think this is a really game-changing concept because you're really taking what people know to be the recruiting process that they're so used to working with within their company, and you're saying, hey, let's do this a little bit differently. But the biggest piece is to, I think, getting buy-in is really this test and failure and test and success and being able to present those results. How has that played out for you in this test and failure? You said you love A/B testing. Tell me more about that. Like what have you seen be successful in implementing these strategies and then using testing mechanisms to make your case for using these methods moving forward?
I think being brave and asking for forgiveness later is one thing. That's to me. When I was on the other side of the Atlantic, to anyone senior enough to tell me no.
That's your MO, Jim.
I think you just have to go about it in I want to do this. Here's how I'm going to measure success. This is the hypothesis. If we fail to prove the hypothesis, that is not a failure on my behalf or my team's behalf. That is just being able to put that hypothesis into a closet and leave it there for a while and not have to worry about it or talk about it. All right? So proving or disproving that hypothesis. Now, if we prove it to be correct and the outcome is what we hoped or even better, fantastic, we can continue with it. Here's how we're going to measure it after launch. This is the logical reason why we should do this. This is the reason why you should care about this, the emotional reason for the change. And here's how we're going to measure it and prove or disprove the hypothesis that suggests we should do this and implement it and facilitate it with you. If you get those three elements right, the logical reason, the head, the emotional reason why someone should care about it, the heart, and then the facilitation and measurement piece, that's the feet. If you ever want me to draw the diagram on a whiteboard, head, heart, feet, shout out to Kim Wiley, who taught me that in the very first place, ex-Google training folks, fantastic model, still use it today. So that's the way that I think about it. And if you can then articulate what you're looking to do there, show the measurement, and give the timelines of when you're going to measure based on different milestones you put in place, oftentimes people are like, hey, you no problem, you've got this. We can always go back, that's easy, but they also see the value in putting a hypothesis away somewhere. When I suggested restricting, candidates to 3 applications a month, no one expected us to be able to double the number of hires in a year because we restricted the application flow. That was what the outcome was. Even I was surprised with that. Right? And that's something that I've done in the past. Restricted candidates to 3 applications a month instead of 30. And you ended up with twice the hires from inbound applications, not less, because it improved the accuracy of the application. The piece I was talking about earlier. That's an extreme example. It took a lot of persuasion to get that through. I also didn't expect that I broke a whole bunch of reporting on that one, but that's a different story. Ask me questions about that. But that's really my methodology and the way I've gone about things.
Yeah, I think as a recruiting function, one thing that I think a lot of recruiting teams haven't felt necessarily empowered to do in the past is to really challenge what we know as the recruiting process. Just like sales runs tests, marketing runs tests. What's to say that as a business unit, recruiting shouldn't be doing the same thing? And so I think through my conversations with a lot of people as I've been doing the podcast has been like, what can we take from other parts of the business, things that they do, like tons of A/B testing?
Yep.
What can we take and do that's going to set us up for success, make our recruiting teams more successful, get us a seat at the table that's seen and heard? So I love all this.
A/B test, didn't give a real example, but job titles is the obvious one for A/B testing. You might have one opening, but with Ashby, you can have two different jobs that feed into that one opening with two different job titles. And you can measure the impact of that, and you can show the data in fantastically colored graphs. That's a true example of, here's the logical reason we'd want to do this. Here's why you should care about it. Here's the results and the measurement. And then we can choose to continue both, or just choose one of those two things, or go and do a whole new test. Anything along those lines. Same goes for your outreach. You can do a bunch of different experiments on different outreach contact emails. Same concepts. You try and do it for a whole process, that gets a little bit more complicated. But there's no reason why you can't take two very similar roles and do a completely different recruiting process for them. So one of the things I'm pushing at the moment is the concept of cohort hiring. Right? That's where you keep a group of candidates together. You get the applications in, same with that whole timing and data and prediction piece I talked about earlier. Close the role. You assess the whole of the candidate pool, because it is a candidate pool. It's an applicant pool. It's a talent pool. It's not a talent stream. You shouldn't hire the first person to get past your hiring process. Assess everybody, right? With an objective process, make it fair and equitable, and bring that cohort through. The pushback I'm getting on that, when I'm suggesting it, whether it's internally or externally, is about time. Because people don't see you moving the candidates through as fast as possible on the individual basis. Some candidates naturally have to move slower, and some move faster in order to keep the cohort together by the stages. So you run another process that's the typical linear recruiting model, where you allow everybody to go through at the fastest possible pace, but at their own pace in effect. And then you compare and contrast the two. My hypothesis that I then prove or disprove is that the cohort model gets you to the fill faster and to a higher quality hire, and your hires overall from that methodology will be far more representative, far more diverse than they are if your recruiters are just taking a snapshot of the applicant pool, the first 10% of the applications, the ones who applied on the first day, and moving those folks through. The likelihood is you've just left people from underrepresented groups who only make up a small proportion of your applicant pool back in the bucket.
Yeah.
And you get through and you hire that first person past the bucket. You haven't assessed that person against all the others coming through behind who you now have to reject in a pretty unfair way. So I'm trying to push that now, but even with something as complex as an entire process shift away from the hyper-growth model of hiring as fast as you possibly can to more of a focus on quality and representation, you can still A/B test to enable you to get to the results of an experiment to prove or disprove your hypotheses. And you're far more likely to be able to drive a change through with the results you get from experimenting than you are by just saying, we should do this.
Yes. And I, for one, am very excited to see the results of this test when you conclude it.
Thank you.
So we talked about continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is a part of hiring excellence based on our hiring excellence framework. Would love to hear, what does hiring excellence mean to you in that context or otherwise?
You already actually touched on it. Sales have this incredible infrastructure around what successful sales are. There are so many different ways of doing it, so many different models and training courses and so on and so forth. But really, it is deep, deep preparation and research before anything actually happens, and everyone is focused on the outcome. Marketing is the same. You build a demand gen engine in marketing, and you've started off with deep math and you know exactly what your outcome is going to be, and then everything else comes into play in the middle before you ever press a button to start the campaign. And yet recruiting, you go along to the meeting, you catch up with the hiring manager, you gather some requirements. Oh, it's the same as what we hired before. Oh, cool. Go to market again. It's the same thing Benji was talking about in his podcast I referred to. Just do the same thing over and over again in different times. It's like, no. Recruiting can have the same level of diligence built into it, excellence built into it. You have to focus on the outcome. I've said it a couple of times already. What does success look like from this hire? What do you expect someone to produce after 6 months? We're in the startup world, right? You need people who are going to be effective early. So 6 months is my measure. More bigger companies, legacy companies might have a longer time period there, but 6 months is a good one for me. What does success look like for that person? Write about it, pull the attributes out, and then work all the way back through. The first thing is, that's their performance review after 6 months. Have they been successful against that? The hiring manager immediately knows exactly what they're going to be measuring, and it comes all the way back through to the case they made for the return on investment as to why the hire should be made. So this is even before headcount planning. This is at the headcount request stage. So to me, hiring excellence is starting at the end result, which is success of the hire, way after you hire them, working it back through, understanding what the offer needs to look like, all of the qualifications, experiences, everything else for that candidate, which then comes back into the structured interviewing to make sure that your entire process is objective, which comes back to screening against those key minimum responsibilities that someone has to have in order to have that success, which makes your screening objective. And then that makes the story cohesive and connected in the job description between success and outcomes and the minimum requirements, comes back through to why the role should be opened in the first place, and helps the finance department understand the impact of why that headcount should open and what you're going to get. And then who's going to be held accountable? Hiring manager, the VP who's requesting the role, all of that piece. So to me, hiring excellence is a connected story that starts at the end with outcome, successful outcome, and works its way all the way back through to what was the business case put forward for why the role should be open in the first place. Recruiting is just a bit in the middle of that. But if you don't do those outer pieces, then once you get to your recruiting process from job opening to offer acceptance, that bit cannot be as successful as it could be without the pre-work and the end piece there. So that's what it means as hiring excellence. And you can put that into place any way, which way you want for the company that you work for.
Absolutely. And recruiters and recruiting teams, they're some of the smartest people I've ever worked with. I know that the capability of creating sophistication like other business units is possible. It's just this enablement and, you know, the ask for forgiveness of like, I'm just going to give it a go. And, you know, even if you have a failed test, it's not a failure. It's just, you know, learning moving forward. So I hope that recruiting teams can heed this advice and hopefully move a little bit closer to that hiring excellence. Last question, my favorite question of all. What is your recruiting hot take?
Can you guess?
I don't know. I feel like you like me probably have a lot of hot takes to provide.
My recruiting hot take, break it down, 22 years. Call the job the right job title. It is the simplest thing. If it is a software engineer, call them a software engineer. If it's an account executive, call them an account executive. Anything in between. It is the thing. What is the industry standard? If the back end of your systems have to go off and do some kind of code matching thing between the structured job titles in LinkedIn, which are natural language and industry standard, back across to whatever you're calling the thing, then you've done it wrong. Just call it what it is. Don't be creative. You will get much, much better results. It is the single biggest incremental gain you could possibly have in terms of a process improvement. And it's really easy to sell to whoever you have to influence. But just call the job what it should be called, and you will have so much more success.
100% agree, because like I said, I've seen some very out of left field things in the wild recently, especially for like customer success managers. I find I'm like, just call it a customer success manager. Internally, it's a completely different game, right? Maybe internally you call your team something entirely different, but when you're trying to get people who have this these skills and capacity and have worked in these capacities before, and they can't tell what the job may entail from the job title, or your example of we're having people apply because they see GPS, but it's really people services. Like, yeah, you're not going to get the results that you want, even though it's kind of like your feel good moment of like, well, we're not just customer success, we're XYZ, but it's the feel good moment doesn't surpass the need for quality application. So definitely something to consider.
I should also add to this, call yourself the industry standard thing for the job that you did. Don't have to use the language that you were given by the company you worked for. No one is going to come at you if you call yourself X and you had some fancy title with unicorns in it internally, right? Call yourself the industry standard on your resume and on your LinkedIn profile. That way, all of these engines, these simple tools that have been created, and the algorithms are 20 odd years old, as I've been describing, they will match you and help you find your next role. It's critically important in times like this.
Yes, 100% agree. Amazing. Well, I think we are coming up on our time. Where should people go to learn more about you and what you're up to at Ashby?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. I often post about Ashby features that are coming out and how I think about using them, which is often very different to the intended usage. So if you're an Ashby customer, that's quite helpful. I do some content creation, not as much as I'd like to. There's a blog post out there why I joined Ashby in the first place. It tells you a bit more about me and my experience and journey. There's some posts about leading without authority, how I got into a leadership role in the first place, and things folks can do. And there's a lot more coming, and oftentimes I'll have touched different elements of content. So follow Ashby on LinkedIn. That's the number one thing to do, and you'll see everything coming from all of us. And there'll be bits in there that I've contributed to or articles under my name as well. More to come in the future.
Amazing. Well, Jim, I really appreciate you being with us on Offer Accepted, and I know that you have lots of good advice to share. So excited to see that come to fruition as we build more content at Ashby. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.